Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer requested presentation, we're going to be talking about SKS cleaning, and specifically I'm going to be showing you how I personally perform routine cleaning on my own SKS pattern carbines. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer for the YouTube commissars. I will be showing some firearm disassembly today, but only for the purpose of routine maintenance, not for the purpose of modification. Additionally, please note that the SKS pattern carbines I will be showing off today are 100% YouTube friendly, as evidenced by their light colored wooden stocks. YouTube feels very strongly about protecting viewers from some of the less savory furniture shades out there, so rest assured I won't be showing off any scary black rifles like this one or this one. With that out of the way, let's dive in. So one of the more popular questions I've received recently is, Triangle, how do I use this thing? And for those who don't recognize it, it is a standard issue SKS cleaning kit, which neatly fits into the trapdoor compartment of your buttstock. Well, the short answer is that you don't actually use it. Unless you're in one of two very specific situations I will expand upon in a moment, I really don't recommend using the issued cleaning kit to actually clean your rifle. Before we get to unpacking why that is, let me share a brief personal anecdote. My job in the U.S. Army was 91 Fox Small Arms Repairman, which means that for a time, my reason for getting up in the morning was to keep weapons running. One of the more frustrating lessons I learned in that role is that militaries generally suck at weapon cleaning. They issue soldiers the wrong tools, and they teach soldiers to prioritize the wrong outcomes. That's largely true of the modern U.S. military, and it's certainly true of historic Eastern Bloc militaries. It all starts in basic training. For generations, drill sergeants have made the critical mistake of using specialized machine maintenance as a vehicle to teach generalized discipline. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the importance of discipline. I'm all for scrubbing floors with a toothbrush, trimming a lawn with nail clippers, SOP wall lockers, and holding impossible standards for hospital corners on racks. What I am deeply opposed to is giving soldiers steel cleaning implements, shaving cream, and chemical-laden wet wipes, and telling them their weapons need to pass white glove inspections by any means necessary. Even after initial entry training, many units continue to reinforce these terrible practices with misguided weapon turn-in procedures, teaching soldiers that a few drops of emulsified carbon in the chamber or a dusty dust cover is a sign of a poorly maintained weapon. All of that is a recipe for accelerated wear, degradation of function, preventable malfunctions, and a lifetime of bad habits which lead to such. So back to this kit. The reason I don't actually recommend using this cleaning kit to clean your SKS pattern carbine is because it is a military cleaning kit. And as a military cleaning kit, it kind of sucks for actual cleaning. For whatever it's worth, I also wouldn't recommend using a U.S. Army issued cleaning kit to clean your AR-15. Again, I'll provide a couple of caveats to that warning in a moment, but for now the advice stands. The main problem here is that proper use of this kit requires the maintainer to use steel components to clean steel components, and that's kind of dumb. This isn't a sword we are trying to sharpen, so whenever possible we want to avoid situations in which we are forcefully applying steel to steel. That's not to say these kits can't be used safely and effectively, which is to say carefully and sparingly, but the point is that they introduce totally unnecessary risk. I can't tell you how many times in my professional career I have seen soldiers create real problems trying to fix fake problems, and I don't want you to do that with your SKS. Whether you see your SKS as an artifact, an investment, a working implement, or even a life-saving tool, there's absolutely no reason to damage your rifle when your only goal was to clean it. With that in mind, before we get to talking about what I actually do recommend using, let's circle back to the reasons I said you might actually want to use this kit, and I see two. First, some collectors are purists, or maybe they even have nostalgic past military experience using tools like this, or for whatever reason, they just want to do what they know or follow historically accurate procedures. Fine. More power to you. As I said, when used correctly, these can be used in such a way that is effective and will absolutely not damage your weapon. It just requires you to pay attention because, again, there is an introduced risk. Second, there is totally something to be said for a rugged backup system. Just because I don't personally use or recommend using these cleaning kits doesn't mean I throw away my cleaning rods or don't keep a cleaning kit in every buttstock. I've got like 20 of these things. They are cleverly designed in some regards. They have some multi-tool capabilities outside of just weapon cleaning, and as such, they can be extremely useful if you don't have anything else. So why not have one on you anyway, even if you probably never use it? That's my approach anyway. So with all that in mind, perhaps one day I will make a video on how to use these kits properly, but for now we're going to talk about what I think is actually much more relevant to a much broader audience, which is how I actually do clean my SKS pattern carbines and what I recommend for those who care about my opinion. Now, before we get too deep into this, I need to hit a couple more brief disclaimers. First, the procedure I will be demonstrating today is intended for routine maintenance, meaning the removal of external debris and residue left by firing non-corrosive jacketed ammunition. This procedure is not appropriate for cleaning weapons which have been used to fire corrosive ammunition or unjacketed lead projectiles. Additionally, the procedure I will be demonstrating today is not an appropriate substitute for proper removal of cosmoline. If you are maintaining an SKS which has been used to fire non-standard ammunition, or you are performing initial unpacking of a weapon from heavy preservative grease, there are different procedures you will need to follow that will not be addressed in this video. Again, maybe I will cover such procedures in a future video, but that's not what we're talking about today. Second disclaimer, and this is kind of a fun one, anytime we talk about SKS cleaning, there will always be people who say something to the effect of, why even bother? And honestly, that's a fair question, so we're going to hit that head on. Listen, as far as auto-loading weapons go, the SKS has one of the lowest preventative maintenance burdens imaginable. It is not at all unusual for me to interact with guys who have owned an SKS since the mid to late 80s, never cleaned it once, and it still runs like a top. So again, we ask, why bother cleaning in the first place? Totally personal preference. I really clean my SKS pattern carbines for two reasons. The first one is that it helps me protect them as investments. And the second reason, and probably the more important reason, is it gives me a great excuse to build deeper familiarity with my weapon. If you've ever watched one of my more technical videos and thought to yourself, gee, it sounds like this guy has a pretty good understanding of what's going on inside of an SKS, a lot of that didn't come from shooting SKSs, although certainly some of it did. A lot of that came from taking them apart and putting them back together, taking them apart, studying them, putting them back together hundreds and hundreds of times, and cleaning is a great excuse to understand all of the little intricacies of the SKS as a machine. So all that said, again, it really is personal preference. If you're out there wondering how often do you need to clean your SKS, honestly, that's up to you. If you're in the mood to clean your SKS, it's probably a good idea. If you aren't in the mood to clean your SKS, you will almost certainly be fine just leaving it be. So third and finally, I just want to be clear from the get-go here that the procedure I am demonstrating today is simply my preferred method, and I am definitely not presenting it as the best or only way to go about this task. Just because I was a 91 Fox in the US Army does not mean that I have any special insight or training regarding the SKS pattern carbine, because obviously I do not. I can tell you from experience that my way works, and I'm guessing that many people will probably find aspects of my technique that they will find work for them as well. But if you have a totally different method that you know works, I'm certainly not telling you that you're doing it wrong. Some people will clean more aggressively than me, some people will clean less aggressively, and as previously stated, some people won't clean at all. And at the end of the day, pretty much everyone's rifles are going to work just about the same. With all that in mind, these are suggestions, not prescriptions. With all that out of the way, let's talk about cleaning supplies. Here we are looking at one of my personal 30 caliber cleaning kits. I buy the individual components in bulk for extremely cheap. I whip together these little packs and just stash them everywhere in my life. I'm not kidding, I have these things stuffed in every backpack, dresser, wherever. It just makes my life that much easier if I find myself needing to clean a weapon on the go. Now, let me be clear, there is no special sauce to these kits. It doesn't matter who or where you get the components from. There are absolutely alternative products which work just as well, if not better, than what I use. And honestly, you don't even need everything that's in these kits. My point in showing off the kit is simply to set the stage for what types of cleaning capabilities we're going to want to have and what types of supplies we might need to exercise those capabilities. First up, I've got a couple pairs of nitrile gloves, and obviously these are totally optional. That said, I personally always wear gloves when cleaning weapons, provided I have gloves available to me. I don't care what you do, that's just my preference, and if you do clean as many guns as I do, it's probably not a bad habit to get into. Next up, we've got CLP. This is one of the non-negotiables. CLP stands for Cleaner, Lubricant, Protectant, and it really does fill all those three roles relatively well. There are totally weapon systems in the world which really do require specialized cleaners, specialized lubricants, and specialized protectants, but fortunately for us, the SKS is not one of those weapons. Like the M4 or AK, for example, you can keep an SKS running indefinitely under most environmental conditions with CLP alone. I personally use ballistol, which has been poured into empty eyedroppers, but once again, it really doesn't matter how you store it, and you can use any brand of CLP you like. Now, before we move on from CLP, let me just say a few words about additional specialized chemicals. Just because you don't need them doesn't mean you can't use them, so I'll touch on that briefly. In terms of specialized solvents or bore cleaners, you can totally throw Hoppy's number 9 or whatever else you want into your bore. However, I don't, and I don't personally see the point. 7.62 by 39 is a relatively low velocity and low pressure cartridge, at least as far as rifle rounds go, and I've never seen jacket deposits ever become a problem in an SKS bore. Additionally, this is not a PRS rifle where little micro deviations in accuracy are going to have any noticeable effect on actual use. In my experience, CLP and gentle abrasion is more than enough to get the job done. So with that in mind, feel free to go nuts with solvents if that's what you're into, but be careful because some solvents can absolutely damage your wood finish, and just know that what you're doing probably isn't going to have much consequence in the long run. Now, while I don't really see a compelling use case for specialized cleaners, specialized lubricants and preservatives absolutely can be worth using if you have them. I don't personally carry grease in my kits, partly because I haven't found a convenient way to repackage it, and partly because I really don't need it. However, whenever I do clean an SKS at home, I do use a little bit of this Slip 2000 Extreme Weapons grease, and I'll show you how I use it when we get to that part. And once again, of course, the brand of grease probably doesn't matter. This is just a product that I happen to know and trust. Next, we got a bore snake. Obviously, any 30 cal bore snake will work just fine. Honestly, I just get whatever brand is cheapest in bulk. And once again, we are going to see a little difference here between what I put in my kits and what I use at home. The bore snake is a super convenient and compact option when cleaning on the go, but obviously you can use a nylon coated steel cable or rigid cleaning rod. Basically, all that matters at the end of the day is you need a way to pull an absorbent fabric and brass brush from the chamber to the muzzle. And you want to do so in such a way that doesn't expose your bore or crown to uncoated steel. With all that in mind, I personally tend to use bore snakes on the go, like I said, and I use a nylon coated steel cable with brass jags when I'm at home. And of course, I'll show you what both of those look like shortly. Next up is patches. You technically don't need patches when you have a bore snake, but you absolutely do need them if you're using a cable or rigid cleaning rod. That said, regardless of your personal bore cleaning solution, patches are still great to have anyway, and today you will see me using them for a lot more than just my bore. In a similar vein, you can see I also throw a couple of pre-treated ballistol wipes in my kit. These are totally optional. Obviously, if you have clean patches in CLP, you can basically just make these wipes on demand, but sometimes these ready wipes are super convenient to have. I probably won't be using them today on the SKS, but I do love stashing these things in AR pistol grips and foregrips, so I still throw them in all my mobile cleaning kits just in case. Next up is Q-tips and plastic picks. I'm lumping these together because they are both a total luxury. You can almost always make do without these, but sometimes they're super handy and they can really make certain jobs a little bit easier. What is most certainly not a luxury is some type of nylon bristled brush, and next to CLP and a bore snake, this is probably the most important piece of the kit. Purpose-built gun cleaning brushes work great, but so do normal bulk pack Walmart toothbrushes. Regardless of what type of brush you have, you just want to make sure you have something. And finally, we're going to want some type of brass or copper abrasive. In my kits, I usually just use a solid copper wool chore boy. Notice I said solid copper and not copper plated. However, a brass bristled brush or even a worn out bore brush can fill this very same role. You will probably see me making great use of worn out brass brushes throughout the cleaning portion of this video. Honestly, that's one of my favorite tools. And that's the whole kit, guys. As I said, you don't need all of this, and you certainly don't need to have the exact same products as me, but as long as you have some CLP, a means to pull fabric and a copper brush through your bore, a nylon bristled brush, and some type of general purpose copper abrasive, you're probably in pretty good shape. So now let's go over how we actually use this stuff in the context of the SKS. So the first step, of course, is going to be a safety check and field strip our weapon. So let's do that now. With our weapon disassembled, the first thing we're going to address is going to be our bore, because that is the only component we are going to be cleaning in which time is a relevant factor. In other words, we want to get the CLP working into the bore so we can essentially let it soak in a little bit while we tend to the rest of the weapon. And then we will finish up the bore last thing before we reassemble. By the way, that little trick is something I picked up from Hickok 45 videos as a teenager, so credit where it's due to the godfather of YouTube on that one. So for the first portion of bore maintenance, I'm going to make a pass with a CLP soaked patch, then a pass with a brass brush, and then one final pass with another CLP soaked patch. I usually just go ahead and flip the patch over. I've already pulled through, add a little more CLP, and use it again. The theory here is we are just loosening up the fouling a little bit and using that brush to create crevices for that CLP to soak in. If I was performing this step with a bore snake, I would only be doing a single pass with the bore snake, having pre-soaked the fabric in front of the bristle portion with CLP, as well as the fabric at the very rear of the snake. This ensures that plenty of CLP is left in the bore when I'm done, otherwise the tail of the snake would soak it all up on the way out. Regardless of which method we've used, the next step is going to be to get a healthy splash of CLP into the gas block. I like to just soak a patch and find some way to push it in and twist it around. Here you will see I am using a worn out board brush for that task. I will then use some type of brass abrasive, either that same board brush we just used, or a little pinch of brass wool to just rough up any cake deposits that may be present in that gas block. I'm then going to hit it one more time with a CLP soaked patch, and now that all of that is soaking, I'm just going to go ahead and set this whole barreled receiver to the side. Now, in no particular order, we are going to take care of the smaller sub-assemblies of the weapon, and I guess today we will work roughly from easiest to hardest. First up is the receiver cover. Absolutely nothing going on here. I just like to give it a little wipe down with my CLP soaked fingers. I'll dry it off with a rag, and then I'll set it to the side. Next up is the magazine, and we're going to give it basically the same treatment. There are a few more nooks and crannies on this component, so I just dig my CLP soaked fingers anywhere that I can, pulling off any loose sediment that I can find. If the magazine is particularly gritty or sandy, that crud will usually collect around the spring, follower, the bottom of the magazine, and around the hinge point, so I'll use a nylon bristle brush to knock that out. Either way, once we are done with all that, we are of course going to rag everything down such that only a thin layer of protective CLP remains, and then we can set this component to the side as well. Next, we move on to the fire control group, and this is where our nylon bristle brush is going to be our best friend. This is not complicated, guys. We just brush this whole unit down like it's a misshapen set of teeth. If you spend more time brushing your fire control group than you do brushing your teeth, you're probably doing one of those things wrong. As always, once we feel good about having hit everything we need to hit, we're going to rag everything down and set it to the side. Next up is going to be our bolt carrier and recoil spring, and once again, our nylon brush is going to be our go-to tool. We're just brushing off any loose debris, and if we have any crusted buildup in this forward area specifically, we might use our copper or brass abrasive to knock that off. That said, we really shouldn't need to work too hard here. I never personally bother with the recoil spring recess, as unless you are low crawling through miles of mud, it's fairly unlikely that you're going to get any real buildup in here. If, however, you do indeed get down like that, I would at that point go ahead and just blast this out with a hose, making sure, of course, to properly dry and lightly film with CLP once you are done. As for the recoil spring, I usually just brush it down with a towel. However, if there's visible gunk, I will go ahead and hit it with a nylon brush. In cases of extreme sand or debris buildup, you may additionally want to weave a clean patch through the spring and do a full wind from top to bottom. However, as I said, that's really only necessary in extreme circumstances. Either way, when we are done, of course, we're going to wipe everything down that we just worked on, and we're going to go ahead and set all that to the side. Moving on to the bolt now, once again, we are of course going to start with our nylon brush and CLP, hitting every surface on the bolt with a particular emphasis on the bolt face. As with most firearms, we want to make especially certain that we're doing a good job of cleaning under the extractor. This is an area where we tend to get more aggressive residue deposits, so it may be necessary to get our brass or copper abrasive into the mix at this point. Here you can see I am just using that worn out board brush again. Super useful tool. Obviously, brass wool can also be used here, or alternatively, there's a lot you can do with a Q-tip or a plastic dental pick and a clean patch. I should note that for regular maintenance, I never take down my bolt assembly, but if you've put a ton of rounds through it without cleaning, it may be prudent to remove the firing pin and extractor to make sure you're really getting all that gunk out of there. Additionally, I always take this opportunity to perform a quick shake test to verify that my free-floating firing pin is indeed moving freely, and if for whatever reason it was not, that would be an indication to take down the bolt and figure out what's going on before firing that weapon again. In rare circumstances, a piece of ruptured primer or some other type of debris can work its way into the firing pin channel, and that will usually require careful cleaning of the firing pin channel itself. Like I said, I don't consider firing pin channel cleaning to be routine maintenance. You pretty much need to do that once to make sure the cosmoline is gone, and then you're good to go for the rest of that weapon's lifetime. But just because I opened that can of worms, let me double click on just how important it is to clean that area carefully. If, for example, you're using a Q-tip, you want to be very careful to make sure you don't leave any cotton balls floating around in there. In fact, for that matter, you want to be very careful to not leave any foreign material in there, including any grease or CLP beyond an extremely thin protective film. A little bit of pooling CLP isn't going to cause problems, but it could potentially congeal with dirt. The point is that the firing pin channel is the home for the firing pin, and it shouldn't be a home for anything else, so the less stuff that ends up in there, the better. Hopefully you didn't need to mess around with the firing pin channel at all, but either way, once we're done with that, we're going to go ahead and, of course, towel everything off and inspect our work. Assuming everything looks clean and we're still passing a shake test, we can now go ahead and set aside our bolt. All right, and the very last subassembly is going to be our gas piston assembly. So, of course, the first thing we're going to do is separate our piston and gas tube. As for the piston, we can just give the stem a nice wipe down, and then we may need to use our copper or brass abrasive to break up the more stubborn carbon deposits you will surely find on the piston face and around the sides of the piston cylindrical head. This should be pretty quick and easy. We're not trying to get everything down to bare metal. We're just trying to keep it from building up. Next, we're going to clean the inside of our piston. Some people have a strong aversion to putting any CLP in their gas systems. I'm not one of those people. I've been doing it this way on dozens of SKS patterns for more than a decade, and it's always worked great for me. Whether or not this step is necessary is subject to legitimate debate, but as I mentioned earlier, whether or not any routine SKS cleaning is also subject to legitimate debate. So as far as I'm concerned, we're just going above and beyond here to preserve our investments and prevent our gas tubes from getting buildup that over the long term can be very hard to get out without really stripping down the metal. With that in mind, this is how I go about cleaning my gas tubes. Basically, all I do is I take 1, 2, maybe even 3 patches, depending on the size of the patches, saturate them in CLP, and press them into the front of the gas tube up to the internal shoulder. If they fit tightly, I'll just push them all the way in, but if they fit more loosely, I'll find some way to grab a hold of them and twist them around, just making sure I'm covering the whole internal surface area of the wider diameter portion of the gas tube. I'm then going to remove those patches, and the way I do that is by inserting my piston tail through the rear of the gas tube and using that to push the patches back to the front. Usually this will give me just enough to grab hold of with my fingers, but even if it doesn't, I can just use a tool like a brass brush to hook it like Velcro, twist it around, and pull it out. Now we're going to clean the narrow portion of the gas tube, and although this is slightly trickier, we're going to use more or less the same procedure with a modification. This time we're going to start with a single clean patch saturated in CLP, and then we carefully feed it into the rear of the gas tube using a twisting motion to work it in until it's fully inserted. Next, and this is the kind of funky part, we're going to use our thumb or any other finger to cover that gas tube hole tightly. Well, simultaneously, we're going to come in from the front of the gas tube with our piston tail, and we're going to use these opposing forces to compress that saturated patch between our piston and our thumb. By compressing the patch, we're making sure it's fitting tightly into that narrow diameter of the gas tube, very much like a spitball. Once it is compressed, we will feel much more friction when we flip around our piston and push that little wad of patch through. And that friction lets us know that it's making contact with all of that internal surface area in that narrow portion of the gas tube. Getting this patch out is much easier. As long as we just push that piston tail all the way in, that patch will just free fall out the front of our gas tube. So now that we've gotten all that loose carbon out of our gas tube, and it should be pretty filthy in there, our next task is simply to get rid of all that excess CLP we just introduced into our gas system. If we fail to get that excess CLP out, we will probably experience some dieseling or CLP combustion on our first few rounds next time the weapon is fired. I personally think concerns about the dangers associated with gas system dieseling are generally overstated, at least as far as the SKS gas system is concerned. However, it's still not a good thing, so we just want to make sure we're avoiding it all the same. In order to get all that excess CLP out and just leave a thin protective film, we're really just going to perform the exact same procedure we just followed, except this time we are going to use clean, dry patches, and instead of starting with the front and working backwards, we're going to start at the back and work forwards. So one last time, we're going to take a clean, dry patch this time and twist it into the rear of the gas tube, sealing it off with our thumb, compacting that patch into a tight ball, and then pushing it through. Make sure your piston is totally wiped down before pushing it through, by the way, just to make sure we aren't pushing excess CLP in behind the patch. That would pretty much defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do here. Now we're going to do the same thing at the front of the piston. A couple clean dry patches go in. We use some type of tool to twist them around and wipe everything off. And then once again, with that freshly wiped down piston, we're going to go ahead and push those patches out from rear to front. Now we should have a clean and dry piston and gas tube, both with only a thin preservative coating, which will absolutely help protect these critical components from the elements, and additionally will make their cleaning that much easier next time. As always, we give everything a final wipe down, reassemble, and then set that assembly to the side. And with all of our sub-assemblies taken care of, we can now turn our attention back to the barreled receiver. We've got a couple of goals here. First, we're going to aggressively scrub our chamber face with our nylon brush. I don't personally like to use brass on my chamber face, but a plastic pick or Q-tips may be appropriate. Additionally, I don't personally clean inside my chamber beyond just giving it the wipe down that comes with a bore cleaning, and after 10 years, not a single one of my rifles has any meaningful buildup in the chamber. Second task, we are going to use our nylon brush and CLP saturated patches to wipe down the inside of our receiver, using the brush to knock loose debris while using the patches to mop up general carbon dusting and otherwise hard to reach debris. If you tend towards obsessive compulsive cleaning standards, of course Q-tips can be great for digging into those hard to reach places. Third task, I am going to pop out my tappet assembly and just make sure everything looks fine here. Honestly, you can generally leave this alone, but I do like to give mine a nice little rub down, and sometimes I'll stick a Q-tip or a patch into the rear side assembly just to pull out any loose carbon in there. As always, wipe down before reassembly. Fourth task, we're going to dry out our gas port. Super simple here, just a dry patch twisted around an old bore brush, making sure any excess CLP hanging out in that gas block is either soaked up or pushed down into the bore. Fifth and final task, we are going to finally clean out that bore, which thanks to the wisdom of Hickok 45 has been marinating this whole time. I am not at all OCD about bore cleaning, so all I'm personally going to do here is 3 pulls of a brass bore brush, followed by 1 pull of CLP soaked patch, followed finally by a single dry patch. If instead of my nylon coated cable, I was using a bore snake, I would just pull that bore snake through 3 or 4 times, applying CLP only to the front of the snake now on all 4 passes. Good enough for government work, good enough for me. And so now the very last cleaning step is just going to be to wipe around inside of the receiver and the chamber area with a rag, getting rid of any excess CLP that might still be hanging around. I save this step for the very end because if I would have done it earlier, there would likely be fresh pools of CLP around the chamber area as a leftover from the bore cleaning process. So now, having thoroughly cleaned the barreled receiver and all of the subassemblies of our SKS, we can talk about lubrication, preservative application, and reassembly. As I said before, lubrication is really optional in my opinion, as even a bone-dry SKS should run great under almost all realistic temperature conditions. Not to mention that if we just cleaned our weapon according to the procedure you just saw me do, we've got a thin film of CLP on pretty much our entire rifle, including all working surfaces, and the lubricant properties of that film are very real. That said, if I do have gun grease available to me, meaning I'm cleaning at home, I do like to apply it to a few places for its exceptional lubricant and preservative properties. Specifically, I will be applying it to the underside of the bolt and the worn patches of the bolt carrier. Always remember that your weapon, through its wear patterns, will tell you exactly where it wants to be lubricated. Additionally, I will use a Q-tip or my finger to apply a little bit of grease to the rails of the bolt and the bolt carrier. Next, I like to put a tiny dab of grease on my fingertip and smear that onto my hammer spring. Finally, I like to get another slightly larger dab of grease in my palm, rub it around, and then smear that on the entire length of my recoil spring. And that's good to go for lubrication in my book. As for preservation, the one thing that I do like to do with rifles that I don't plan on shooting for a while is to apply a very thin coat of grease to the bore, just to give that critical surface area an added layer of protection during extended storage. The way I do that is I just take a dry patch, work in a very conservative amount of grease into that patch, and I pull that through the bore one time. Of course, if I was using a bore snake, I can just apply that same small amount of grease to the tail of the bore snake and achieve exactly the same effect. As long as you are using a very small quantity of a relatively thin gun grease, this will cause absolutely no issues when firing, and you don't need to bother cleaning it out the way you would with a heavier grease like Cosmoline. That very first bullet you fire will have no problem pushing a tiny bit of grease out of the bore without any consequential increase in pressure. And with that, it's time for reassembly, guys. This isn't a reassembly video, and because I was working on a janky Albanian today, I had to do a lot of it off camera just because I couldn't get the leverage I needed underneath the camera. But as long as we're talking about reassembly, let me just throw in a couple of very brief tips. The number one mistake I see guys make when reassembling an SKS is failing to pull the charging handle back when they're installing the magazine. If they put the magazine in after the bolt carrier, you can do either side of the weapon first. It's up to you. Sometimes it'll feel like it went in, but rest assured the SKS magazine will not seat properly unless you pull your bolt back on reassembly. So if you forget to do this, you might look silly 30 seconds later when your magazine falls out of your gun. Just another reassembly trick. Sometimes your recoil spring will not properly seat until you pull back on the charging handle. So if you hear a loud click the first time you charge the weapon, and that does not reoccur on subsequent cycling, that's perfectly normal and just your weapon letting you know that everything has fallen into its correct place. And as with any firearm reassembly process, it's always best practice to finish up with a little functions check just to make sure everything is working as it should. First, we're going to make sure our bolt locks back on an empty magazine and that it does not lock back with our magazine decompressed. Obviously, with a clear magazine and chamber, we're going to go ahead and dry fire our weapon, listening to that hammer drop and holding the trigger to the rear. We're going to cycle the bolt one time, slowly let off the trigger, and verify that we have an audible and tactile reset. Last step is going to be to activate our safety and verify that with our safety engaged, that trigger cannot be depressed. Having verified that this weapon is still working normally, I'm going to go ahead and release tension on the hammer spring. Not that it really matters, that's just my habit. Re-engage the safety, once again, not that that matters. Give it one final rub down with a towel, and this weapon is ready for short to medium term storage. And that's it, guys. That's how I perform routine cleaning on my own SKS pattern carbines. Like I said, it's certainly not the only way or even the best way, but it's what I've been doing for more than a decade now, and it works great for me. If you have any questions about this video, you'd like to share tips and tricks you've discovered yourself, or you just want to take this opportunity to remind me that no matter what I do, 5% of the world's population will just hate my guts, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section below. As always, if you found this video to be helpful or at least worth the time you spent watching it, I'd greatly appreciate if you could take the time to do the YouTube stuff, like, comment, and subscribe. That's what motivates me to make more videos, and I really do appreciate it. Other than that, thanks again for taking the time to check out this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.